I see a grey marine and want to paint it black. Painting black is undoubtedly one of the hardest things in miniature painting, and something that I think we all struggle with. Over the years, I've developed a number of different approaches to tackling black, and they all kind of achieve different things. There's a few different ways to do a few different things that have a few different outcomes. I was asked by my friend TJ to give him a private lesson showing a kind of crash course in how to paint black. Now, normally I would probably do this course over about a 3-hour period, but me and TJ only had an hour, so I decided to do a condensed version of it. Initially, TJ was going to paint along with me, but he decided that he'd rather just kind of take the information in because I had to move quite fast to get it all into 1 hour, to be honest. However, I figured that by committing it to a YouTube video here, both TJ could look back over it, and perhaps some of you may be also able to glean a few things from it. So this is a complete crash course in various different approaches, methodologies and philosophies behind painting black. It's a lot of information and it's still going to be quite a long video. So sit back, strap in and let's paint some black. We're doing black today, I believe.
Yeah.
Is that what we discussed?
Yes.
Okay. Where are you sort of at with black at the moment, first of all? What do you sort of find difficult with it? I guess what you're saying is actually kind of things that are predominantly black, getting them to... I think one of the real difficult things with black, one of the things that I certainly struggled with for a really long time, is highlighting it in such a way that it still reads as black.
Right.
It's very easy for black to... Sorry, just fiddling with camera settings slightly. It's very easy for black, when it's highlighted, to stop looking like black.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the clues about what we can do about this is actually when we look at a primed miniature under our painting lights. So obviously, I've got 3 lights on here coming from different directions, but they're all sort of lighting the miniature most intensely from above, which is kind of how we light miniatures anyway when we paint them, right?
Right.
So if we actually just look at what our studio lights are telling us, we can already start to get some basic information. For example, we can see that there's a highlight here fading up towards the top that carries on along the arm and the hand, and it just all sort of fades up towards the top, kind of in line with this little plate here. When we look at the head, we can see that the highlight actually doesn't collect around this little V shape like we often think it does. It actually collects sort of more up here on the dome of the head.
Right.
And then sort of drags towards the front here. So we can kind of, in terms of highlight placement, we can kind of find a lot of that information provided for us just in how our light naturally hits our miniature. So what I'll often do is start off with my miniature kind of just held under the camera like this, and I'll just take a quick screenshot of it.
Okay.
And that tells me my lighting information. It's little subtle things like you wouldn't normally think to highlight under here. You would think, how the hell could the light hit underneath that knee pad? But having that information there for you in a photograph is a good cue for kind of where to place your highlights. But knowing where to place your highlights that's not really the problem, in my opinion. You can place highlights almost completely incorrectly and a thing will still look lit. Do you know what I mean? It's what's going to be kind of telling the story is the level of contrast and the readability of what you're painting. And the issue that we have with black is that those two things are kind of almost in trade-off. That's kind of where most people struggle, is that the things that push the most contrast with black also tend to sacrifice the most readability.
Right.
And that's kind of where it starts to get a bit difficult. So what I'm going to show you is just a couple of ideas that will let you kind of choose for yourself where on that sliding scale of contrast versus readability you want to live, okay? Let's first of all talk about the most common thing that we see when it comes to highlighting black. let's talk about the thing that we see all the time. So we'll start off, say, on this arm here. And what we'll normally see is edge highlights in neutral grey, right? That's what GW loves to show us. It's usually like admin grey, Eshin grey. Is there a brighter one that they sometimes use as well? I think it's like admin grey and Eshin grey normally. I don't follow a lot of their tutorials, so I'm not.
Honestly, I haven't in a long time either.
Okay, so first of all, let's just talk about edge highlighting with neutral greys. So I'm going to do a thick edge highlight first of all, which is in a darker grey. Pick out all the edges in that little area, and then we'll use a lighter neutral grey. Obviously, if you make any little mistakes, then you can just come back in with your pure black, find your errors, paint them out with a spot of your pure black. Before you know it, you've got something that is kind of highlighted in the way that GW would do it. They may also sometimes use a third brighter grey. It depends on what level the tutorial is at. You will sometimes see them just use a third one and just do sort of the corners. They won't go all the way along the length of lines with the final colour. They'll just kind of hit sections of the lines that are facing upwards, or, you know, just the kind of little finishing off part. But that's kind of exactly how GW would present highlighted black. Okay.
Yep.
And okay, so we got some problems here. We got good points and bad points here. It very clearly reads as black. There's no dispute in that. It looks like black. And the reason it looks like black is because we're very minimally encroaching onto the black. That's kind of exactly what makes it work so well, is that we're not wiping out very much black with our highlights at all. So the majority of paint that's left visible is black, right? The issue is that the contrast isn't great. Like, just the shininess of our paint alone is enough to wipe out those highlights. Like, yeah,
you can barely see it when it's the lights on it the right way.
If I place the reflection of the natural light, the environmental light, so that it falls where the highlight should fall, then it looks fine. But as soon as I move it, like, I've just lost all contrast now, because I've got this natural sympathetic reflection running straight across the middle of my black, and these really low contrast highlights that just aren't bright enough. Obviously, there's a couple of solutions to that. You know, we could really push ourselves from a skill perspective and go to an even brighter fourth grey and do some really, really fine extreme edge highlighting. That is, of course, an option. However, it's still not doing a ton for the contrast, is it? Like, it's better, and it's going to be very hard to do that across an entire miniature. Like, can you imagine painting an entire Space Marine having to do 4 consecutively thinner and thinner lines of black around the edge of every single armor panel?
Much less an army.
Right. It's not going to be very enjoyable, and it's also going to be really freaking hard work. So, I'm now going to just paint over this. I'm just going to delete it, essentially, using some thin down black paint. So just to quickly show you, I don't know if you own either of these paints. It would be sheer chance if you did, because you didn't know that I was going to use them. If you don't own them, then obviously any similar colour will work, but these two particular paints happen to also be particularly good for the techniques that I want to show you. I've got Heather Blue from Reaper Master Series here, and I've got Bright Turquoise from Reaper Master Series. These are kind of my two go-tos when it comes to highlighting black. These are the two colours I use, and they're going to kind of show you two varying extremes of an idea, which is, you know, kind of the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off with this Heather Blue. And it's essentially a blue-grey. It's kind of a Space Wolves grey with a touch more blue.
Yeah.
It's a very... So it's... Because it's a grey base, it's still fairly neutral. It's just been sort of toned off in a cold direction by the addition of that blue. So what that does for us is it serves a number of functions. By being mostly a neutral tone, you know, by being a grey, it's quite easy to persuade it to blend into black. It's quite easy to kind of use it adjacent to black without it getting too upset. You don't have to do much hard work to get it to work with black. Obviously, it does have, because it's a grey, it has a white base to it, so it's not the most transparent paint in the world, which can mean that the first stages of blending up from the black need a little bit more work. But all in all, it's pretty easy to work with, and it's fairly neutral. However, because it has that cold tone, because it has that blue element to it, obviously, when we paint black, we can't go any darker than black, right? So we can't create any contrast using our shadows. All of the contrast we create has to come from our highlights. And our shade tone and our mid-tone are already the same colour. They're already both black. So we've got everything against us when it comes to creating contrast. By using a cool tone to highlight black, it helps a little bit with that. It generates additional contrast that wouldn't normally be there. So the reason we normally use cold tones for blacks is because they're really, really good at creating extra contrast in a situation where we have very little going on to create contrast. So what I would normally do with this heather grey, if I'm highlighting black with it, I would normally just add a touch of water to it, not much. Reaper paints are fairly thin already, so they don't need a ton of thinning. And the first thing I would usually do is just get the very extremes of my highlight blocked in with this colour. So this is just the actual sort of top end of the highlight. One of the smartest things you can do is grab yourself some Retarder Medium. This just makes your paints take longer to dry. And when you're working on blacks, being able to wet blend is going to really help, because a lot of the transitions you're going to be doing are just going to be a pain in the ass without wet blending them.
Right.
This Retarder Medium is just a gel, and you put a bit of it on your palette and you add it to your mixtures of paints. So I just pull my palette down into the shot on that. So my Retarder Medium is just up here. And I'm just going to put a little blob of that here and a little blob of black here. And I'm going to make this kind of slightly transparent black, which is, you know, mostly a mixture of black and Retarder Medium. You can kind of see how, because it's got so much Retarder Medium in it, it's kind of transparent. You see how when I drag it out, you can like see the pink of my sponge through it, right? And we can still thin this like we normally would. You know, we can still get it to a thinness that we're happy with. But this is going to take a lot longer to dry than normal acrylic would now. So what we can do is just come up to that highlight right underneath it and just paint a line of this in pretty thickly. We don't need to be shy with it. And now what that's going to let us do is reload our brush with that heather blue again. And we've now got something to wet blend into that is going to take forever to dry. So we can now just wet blend down, and you'll see the paint just getting more and more transparent and more blended as it goes down. Just keep working at it until you've kind of got it where you want it. It's still going to be quicker than edge highlighting, because you're doing like your top, middle, and you're doing sort of your mid-tone and like two of your highlights all in one procedure.
Right.
And then we can just start to sort of streak in just a few very, very basic edge highlights. So we sort of got that gradient already in. And we're just reinforcing that gradient with just one stage of edge highlights. I tend to choose a line thickness that's kind of somewhere in the middle, to be honest. Already, just with 2 colours of paint, whereas our previous workup involved 4 different colours of paint, just with 2 colours of paint here, we've already got way more contrast. And this is still wet. It's going to take a long time to dry, so you've got plenty of time to work with it. What you can even do is, if you still want to smooth out the transitions a touch more, you can even mix a little glaze just from that same mixture of black and retarder. Just mix like a little thin glaze like this, and with just a small amount of it on your brush, just glaze downwards out of your highlights, and that'll just help smoothen out those transitions a bit if you're not 100% happy with them. Yeah, and it's honestly just one pass like that is enough. Way more contrast than the neutral greys gave us, just having that slight cold tone. And if we want even more contrast, we can just do the same final stage that we did with the edge highlighting. So we take some of the blue-grey colour, mix a bit of white into it, and we'll just pick out
those hard corners.
Just some top corners. And once again, look how much contrast we got just for like that 2-second pass with the brush. This gives us a ton of contrast, and it still reads pretty black, right? Like it doesn't make the area look like it's blue-gray. It looks like highlighted black, right?
Right.
So this is an option that I tend to use most of the time. When what I want is something that is still definitely black, but has better contrast than just edge highlighting with neutral greys.
Yeah.
For this, I'm actually not gonna delete this and paint over it again. I'm actually going to work on a separate area just to actually show you the full beauty of what we're doing. There is an option 3. Which is this turquoise, and you may have seen me use this a few times.
I think so. Didn't you do that on, like, I think it was the Judicia video?
The Judicia, the Biker Chaplain, my Ghost Keel battlesuit for my Tau army, like quite a few of the stuff that's gone onto YouTube has involved this. So the thing with this is, it's a turquoise, right? It's pretty extremely different from black. But turquoise has this advantage of it's a cold tone that has some warmth to it. Because obviously it's a blue-green, which means somewhere in that mixture there's an amount of yellow, right?
Yep.
Because there's an amount of yellow, what we can also do is, instead of highlighting up through white, we can highlight up through ice yellow, which again is just going to keep pushing extra contrast for us, because like when you put this next to black, like they couldn't be more different if they asked to, right? So if we're committing to the idea of just doing away with neutrality completely and just going for tones that aren't even pretending to be neutral, then this is pretty extreme. The downside is obviously what we're doing here isn't going to read as black as the one that's just highlighted with a slightly cold toned grey. Yeah, it's not going to read as black as this, because at the end of the day, like, this is, it's just a little bit colder than neutral grey, and we've still kept the highlights fairly minimal in terms of how much they encroach into the black space that's actually present on the miniature. Obviously, we've got this blend now because we had that stripe of black and we wiggled between them to do a quick wet blend. But what we've got on show is still, by and large, it's still, mostly black, which means that the workup reads as mostly black. Okay, so we're going to start out with that same mixture of black and retarder, and we're just going to add a little bit of turquoise into it.
Okay.
That's kind of where we will begin. And we end up with this sort of transparent blacky green kind of color. You can barely even see the green in it, to be honest. But we'll use this just to sort of build up to some highlights. So anywhere that we want to place a highlight, just whip in a bit more turquoise. And what's happening here is that as we're adding more color, we're also diluting the amount of retarder that's in it.
Okay.
And so we're getting to more of a concentrated paint again. You notice I'm using a mixture of like painting the volumes and just painting the edges.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because if you work too much on the volumes, obviously we're going to just wipe out so much black that it stops looking black.
Yeah.
But then there are certain shapes like, the sphere of the knee pad where you just kind of need to work the volumes in order to make it look like a sphere.
Right.
So I'm just kind of using my judgment.
Yeah.
And sort
I highlight for you to get a circle.
Yeah, where I've got sort of big panels that don't need any sort of volume work done on them, then I can just kind of edge highlight. But on the areas where I'm a little bit more restricted for space and I kind of maybe need to light the volume properly in order to actually show what it is, then I will light the volume. So in this miniature, we've been assuming that there's a light source kind of here, kind of, 45 degrees from the top, poking down at our guy. And so we're lighting things as if there is that light source present. When you start mixing the two, when you start mixing volumes and edge highlighting, obviously you're going to be moving away from something that looks totally realistic. And you're going to be sort of making an active choice to move towards something that's a little bit more of a fantasy situation, something that wouldn't necessarily occur naturally. But it's also a really good way to balance, time saving versus quality, which is something that tends to be kind of at the front of my mind when I work, trying to find that right balance of, how can I do the best for my customer in the least time possible. So once we start to get a few basic volumes of turquoise worked up, then we can just start to introduce this ice yellow, very slowly at first, and just continuing to follow the volumes that we've already started mapping out. The first thing that grabs me is I can already tell now, I've only just started to add any actual lightener to this. I've just been using various concentrations of the turquoise so far.
Right.
But I think we can already see, like, the contrast is extreme.
Instantly.
Right. So as soon as we get onto, like, the second highlight here, because the contrast is so extreme, we're going to be starting to highlight pretty small pretty quickly. And this is another one of the kind of downsides to lighting black this way, is that you have to start to get pretty precise pretty quickly. I personally really like it and think it's worth it, but not everybody will. You can, of course, add in the odd little sort of scratches and stuff to help you not need to be as precise. That's one of the reasons why I do that whole textured highlighting thing, is because it allows you to kind of deliberately be a bit rough here and there.
Sure.
Which is, good for kind of helping to speed you up a little. You can see it really does not take much of this at all to start to get some really, really high contrast. And if we go for one final stage, we have something that very immediately reads as lit.
Yeah, definitely.
Personally, I think this is the most striking. This reads to me as having the most contrast, but it also reads as the least black. And that's kind of where you have to make that decision as to where on the scale you want to fall. Because, obviously, as we've demonstrated, you can add as much cold tone as you want to create greater contrast than greys can really manage. That's definitely an option. Or you can just slightly cool down the greys and improve the contrast quite a lot that way. Or you can just stick with neutral greys. You know, if that's something that you're happy with, then there's nothing stopping you from just sticking with your, you know, your normal neutral greys and just being happy with that. But each of these things kind of brings something different to the table, right? And it's, to me, the trick is figuring out what's giving you the most advantage for what you're trying to achieve. I'm sorry, I'm just really, really rushing these highlights in just to sort of have... I literally just want a reference to the third kind of idea. So we can, you know, if we sort of go anti-clockwise around this, we can kind of see the progression of contrast. You know, this is probably the most sort of logical in most people's heads, but gives us the least contrast. This is a slight sort of upgrade. You know, this is the kind of 200 IQ play. And then this is the kind of Maverick play, right? Where what we're doing is, it's definitely higher contrast than this, but have we ventured too far away from black now? And that's kind of the question you have to ask. If we were doing the thing with the shoulder pad and the cold blue, if we wanted to light our shoulder pad in line with that arm, we're going to need a much bigger band of our cold blue to create a convincing highlight. And like all of this messiness and this experimentation and stuff, like this is stuff you should be doing on your miniatures. You know, if you're just painting for yourself and you've got nothing to lose, the only way you're going to learn how these techniques feel, how easy or difficult they are, is by doing them, right? So if you've got a miniature that's your own and you're just painting it for the fun of it, that's a perfect time to try out this kind of stuff and, you know, figure out what works for you. Obviously, you know, we can spend a bunch of time on that if we wanted to. We could sit there and just work on, you know, wet blending a shoulder pad for 45 minutes, but it's not really necessary to communicate the idea. You can see, you know, as the sort of transition of color is building towards the top, it gives a very different look to doing it on smaller shapes like this, you know. If we look at these volumes, we've essentially got a cylinder, a cylinder, and a cylinder in three little cross sections. And then what we've got here is kind of an angular shape, you know. We've got sort of a couple of triangles beside each other, or a triangle and a rectangle beside each other. And so just through kind of stacking all of these small volumes together, we've got a lot of intensity in a small area. Whereas on this bigger volume, you know, it's going to take us a lot longer to get all the way up to this same level of intensity because we've got so much space to work with.
Right.
And the effect that that's going to have is it's going to change the perception of contrast, because that we're doing exactly the same blend, but we're dragging it out over so much of a larger area that the perception of contrast is drastically altered as a result. Like, these two things here are exactly the same colors, you know, but this looks so much less bright. And it's because the gradient goes over such a broad space.
Right.
You know, and like I say, like in order to really understand this, you'd have to be willing to sit there and you know, properly finish this gradient. And in the time constraints that a lesson gives us, you know, working a gradient like this, I might have to spend half an hour just on this, and it's not really very interesting for you to watch me do. So, you know, I understand that it's a rough version of what I'm trying to demonstrate, but you know, it's still pretty easy to look at it and, you know, see the difference in how the contrast is affected by how much space the blend is focused over. And that's actually something you kind of want to be mindful of as well, because, you know, if you're working on like a really small area, like the top of the helmet here, you know, if I just blob some blue-gray just up here and up here, you know, just to really sort of roughly demonstrate, my next highlight is going to be the one on the front of the faceplate here.
Yeah.
And what we end up with is this looks like quite a small area, right? And so we're going to get a similar level of brightness to this, right?
Right.
But the highlight that's right next to it is this little faceplate highlight, which is even tinier still. And like, look how intense this little tiny highlight looks.
Right.
Because it's so small, it's really grabby.
Yes.
And that's kind of, it's sort of demonstrating the same thing that this demonstrates, but in the opposite direction. You really need to think about how bright you want to take various areas, because if you just spread this gradient out evenly, like I started to here, it's just going to look so dull next to an area where the gradient is tighter, like this.
Right.
And as a general rule, if we're trying to paint black, if we're trying to get something that reads as black, then actually keeping those gradients as tight as possible is really helpful for achieving that, because we're then allowing as much black as we can to be left on display.
Black on the surface.
Right, which goes back to that point we made about the readability, you know, that the more black we leave on the flat surfaces, the more it reads as black. So you see, if I just darken that whole thing, look how much brighter it suddenly looks just from... I've actually darkened it, but it looks brighter.
The highlight looks more intense because the rest of it's darker.
Right. So it's just about that contrast differential.
Yep.
And if we were to just focus the highlight for our shoulder into a really, really small space, then it would keep up well with this, which is great. And it would keep up well with this, which is great. But the problem we're going to have then is when we turn the miniature around, what have we got?
Right.
Right. So this is where we have to start improvising a little bit, because sometimes the rules do not cover all eventualities. Okay? So that's why you'll often see edge highlights that go round into the area that isn't in the light.
Mm-hmm.
Now again, you know, I'm just scribbling just to kind of demonstrate the point, but the problem with, like, we got this right by intensifying it in towards this kind of tight area where our other highlights are, and it starts to make more sense. But then if we're looking at the miniature from the back and we've got nothing going on here, this is just black, then our highlights here and along here are going to start to struggle a little, right? So, you know, if I just paint a rough highlight just in here, paint one just in here, and if we maybe said that we sort of lit that, something like that, then we need something going on the underside here, even though there shouldn't be, even though the rules tell us that there can't be light under there if the light source is above. We need something going on to keep a relationship going in this area Otherwise, this starts to all look too intense, and we end up with a situation like we've got here, where this is so intense that we can barely see this. And what we'd actually have to do to combat this is just take it brighter, essentially. So, you know, in order to make up for the fact that we don't have enough intensity, we sort of force it just by going brighter than we should. And this is why, this is the ultimate conclusion that I've been bringing you to. And this is why set recipes for highlighting don't work. Because the size of the highlight dictates how bright it needs to go. So I can't just say highlight with, you know, base coat with Abaddon black, highlight with admin grey, highlight with Eshin grey. Like, I can't do that, because when you're just edge highlighting everything, that's fine. Of course that's going to work, because your highlights are the same size everywhere that they're present.
Yeah.
Nothing changes. But when we start to actually look at painting volumes, the size of highlights also affects how bright they look. And that's particularly pronounced on black, where we've got no mid-tone to help kind of guide our eyes through a transition. So like, on this grill here, if I highlight this grill and the top of the head here exactly the same amount, it doesn't look right. So I actually have to take the top of this head all the way up to like pure white in order to make it look appropriately bright against the faceplate here.
Yeah.
Did you see how, again, obviously, you know, we've got to the point now where I'm not demonstrating how, so I accept that I'm painting very rough now, but if we look at the relationship between those two highlights, the one on the faceplate and the one on the top of the head, the relationship looks like it makes sense. Like, the brightness differential between them looks like it makes sense. But there's no white in this one, whereas there is white in this one.
Right.
So the kind of experimentation process of it all, when it comes to highlighting black, I think at least, revolves mostly around learning not where to place your highlights, but how bright to make them. That's what I think is the big secret. You can get away with all sorts of nonsensical bullshit, like putting highlights on undersides of things in order to, you know, maintain a relationship of intensity between these other highlights. You can do all of this nonsensical stuff that doesn't, you know, theoretically have any place in painting. It doesn't matter, because the presence of a highlight here isn't because there should be a highlight. The reason we want a highlight here is in order to talk to these two highlights and stop them from looking like his arse is radiating sunlight. And it's only through that sort of building that relationship between each volume that you can get something that fully makes sense as a whole. Which kind of brings me to the final point, which is when painting difficult colours like black, completely paint one area at a time. So for example, you see I completely painted this arm, albeit I need to obviously finish off the fingers, but completely paint one area at a time, because that way you can build up the relationships between that area and its adjacent areas in order to ensure that you're maintaining cohesion across the whole miniature. So like, for example, if I'd have painted this collar in, like I need this here first to tell me how bright this should be, right? If I paint this in first, then by going all the way up to white, I'm probably then going to make myself think that I need to go up to white here. But if I go up to white here, I've got no way to make this intense enough, because this is supposed to be getting more light than this. So I have to paint this, I have to completely finish this face area in order to know how bright this collar should be. So by understanding that painting one area at a time allows me to understand the relationship to the next area, what I end up with overall ends up making a ton more sense, because I've broken it down piece by piece by piece. So there you have it. I did give fair warning. It is a lot of information. I accept that it is a hell of a lot of information. But, you know, it's a video, right? You can scroll back and you can look over various things again. And, you know, it doesn't hurt to kind of spend a bit of time breaking it down. And I do think that it's quite nice to be able to sit and kind of discuss everything you think about one subject with someone. So this was actually a really fun lesson for me as well. Do you have any other little cheaty tricks or tips or cool ways that you like to paint black? If you do, feel free to drop a comment, let me know, let's have a chat about that. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked it. And you can of course subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing here on YouTube. I do also have a Patreon, and if you really love the content, you can pledge on Patreon from as little as $1 a month to help support its creation. There's a link to that in the description, along with all my social medias for you to be able to catch me there. I'm going to get out of here now, folks, but thank you so much for watching. Let's roll those end credits, and I'll see you in the next one.